Well, hello everyone, and welcome to yet another wheel tapping. So this one we kind of teased a little earlier, and it's going to be covering 1822 PNW. I'm your host, Chris Whipan, and welcome for joining. Now, you kind of noticed if you were online and watching the video that Tony's not with me today, but that's okay. I kind of have somebody to stand in, and it's none other than Ken Kuhn himself. How you doing, Ken?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here.
So unless you're living in Iraq and you haven't been around any of the Wave 5 All Aboard extravaganza, Ken is actually the author of 1822 PNW. So he is joining me both as special guest star co-host and going to rock it out. And then he's also going to have a little inside information about PNW. So welcome, Ken. Thanks for stepping up. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm pumped to talk more about PNW, as always.
Right. Now, Tony, if you listened to last week with the or last month with the 1822 mechs, he did kind of tease that PNW is probably going to replace mechs as his all-time favorite 22 system-based game. And, I'm not going to say he's wrong, but I'm curious to see what ends up happening once we get a good chunk of plays in, right?
You know, I was thinking about this, actually. I was hoping, I knew he couldn't be here today, but I was like, the sad part is he's not going to be caught on air saying that this is his favorite. He's only said that to me in back channels personally. So, he might have to come on later and either say, oh, Ken's crazy, I never said that, or, yeah, Ken's right, it is the best.
Maybe that's why he's actually not here, is he just doesn't want to be, put in that corner. So
he's so torn. So torn.
He really is. Mixed loyalties, that man. But hopefully he's at home, hard at work on the rule set for 18 India as we prep for that, which we're excited about. And, well, we talk about it every time. So the update is we're working on it.
So we are.
We're working hard.
Getting so close. So close.
Yeah. So in case you didn't know, there's a little... Ken is actually the person who works with GMT to actually publish this game. He is the developer for 18 India and upcoming 18XX titles. I'm actually doing the graphic design and artwork for most of the things inside the box. So that's me. And then Tony and his team are the ones actually making the stuff inside the box. So
full team effort.
It is. It takes it takes a village and then some, I must say.
That's right.
But we're not here for the 18 India update, even though you might be. We are actually here to talk about a completely different company. Some might say a competitor. And I'm kind of curious how Ken pulled that off. No.
Not at all. We're all in this together. We're making 18XX more available to more people. It's winning, winning, winning.
Exactly. It's why you put a Burger King right next to a McDonald's. Rising tides float all boats. It's the exact same thing. So Ken, real quick, I will say, if you guys want to learn more about Ken, learn more about his map for Age of Steam that's coming out. He's not just in development for, this one game. He's also working on authoring this. He has other irons. He's got a lot going on. So I encourage you to check out actually the recent Train Shuffling podcast from last month, where they did a nice full depth interview, and it was a full hour before they even got to talk about PNW. So that's it. If you want all your Ken goodness, that's where you go.
Check the other podcast.
Yeah. How are those guys? They're always nice. They've had Tony on. They don't like me apparently, but that's cool. I get it. It's a New England thing.
Super great.
Yeah.
Oh man.
What prompted you to want to design an 18XX game? I mean, I know when everybody gets into a hobby, or gets into the board gaming, there comes a point where everybody's like, oh, I have an idea for a game, right? I think that happens to pretty much everybody. Some people act on that. Others don't. They're just idea guys, and that's fine. But But what made you flip that switch?
Yeah, so for me, I mean, I mentioned this on the Train Shuffling podcast, but I'm on a personal conquest for the Pacific Northwest Railroad history to be recognized in gaming.
Okay.
I live in Seattle. I love the area. It's one of the most beautiful parts of the entire world, and it's got a lot of rich history, just like so many other parts of the world. So I definitely had checked out some of the other titles in the 18xx world that had Pacific Northwest place and found them to be wanting for me. And so I was like, something needs to happen here. And at the time, I was playing a ton of 22. It's one of my favorite 18xx games of all time. I've played 50 or 60 different 18xx titles, which is just a drop in the bucket seemingly, but it just has really resonated with me. And so I was like, what if we could tell the story of Pacific Northwest railroading? It lines up very well with 22 system already with some tweaks. So let's put those things together, place it in a space that is really near and dear to my heart. And before you know it, COVID happened, gave me a ton of extra time to work on a little hobby project, and here we are.
Excellent. So what in your mind, I mean, you called out that you like the 22 system. What to you really sets it apart from, the 30 system or, when we talk about 62 and the merger system and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, the 22 system, the thing that really sets 22 apart is the way in which it's able to create a narrative arc. So you start the game with all of these miners, and they're the only thing in play. So many other games start with privates and majors, or miners and majors, or the miners are little majors that don't stay little very long. And so in 22, one of the things I love is that you tell a grander story of the history of railroading in an area, because you tell it from that little, hey, this is just a really small railroad that began in this area as a local railroad that literally moved logs from where they were coming down the hill to the water, or after they went down the river, from the river to the place where they were loading the boats. And so they were just so much short track railroads at the very beginning, and then eventually the story kind of becomes bigger and bigger, and then tells kind of this more nuanced or gives this more nuanced picture of these major companies coming into the area. And specifically for PNW, what's great is there were so many small little minor companies doing all this work, laying so much track in the Pacific Northwest. And then in the late 1800s, the majors from the east were literally coming across and deciding to connect in to what was already being done in the Pacific Northwest. And so it just feels so perfect to be able to say, oh, hey, really what happened is these miners did a lot of the work, not all of the work, but a lot of the work. And then the majors came in from the east, which is represented in PNW. And then they kind of converged on the area, bought out these miners, put them all together. And then we're running these huge routes from, the Midwest through the Pacific Northwest. So 22 system gives you that arc in a way that very few games are able to. And so because of that, it felt like a perfect fit. And then it just needed some tweaks, right, to make sure that it felt more specifically PNW than some of the other 22 games.
Awesome. So it sounds like to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you put a lot of research into understanding the companies and the regional history. Did you find anything super surprising as you started to dive into that?
I don't know about super surprising. I think I found some things that made me just happy. There's little things like the first railroad that existed in Washington State is started in the town that my best friend grew up in. So Stevenson, Washington, turns out on the Columbia River Gorge had the first railroad in Washington State. And then some of the things made me not happy, like Portland was way more involved with the early development of the rail in the Pacific Northwest than Seattle was. Right. So that kind of hurt my heart a little bit, but I've gotten over it. And we might talk about later some of the rules that I had to implement to make sure that rivalry, that brotherly love rivalry that exists between Seattle and Portland is present in the game. And then another thing that's really fun is my wife and I like to get into the mountains. We like to go paddleboarding in mountain lakes and do a little bit of hiking.
Cool.
And so there's actually a railroad outside of a town along one of the highways in the mountains called Leavenworth. And I actually was driving out to a trailhead, and they had like a sign for a little railroad that had been taking basically logs from logging this area and then running it down to Leavenworth so it could kind of join up and be sent along. And it was just, I was like, oh my gosh, I actually read about this railroad, and here I am actually getting to see it. And you know, it's those things that for some of us trained gamers who really love the history, we just kind of get excited about. So those are some of just the little things that are really like hyper local, hyper specific.
Right.
And then also, you know, just the way in which the majors came across is just a cool story. And they showed up to the Pacific Northwest and went, oh, great. There's lots of stuff going on here already. And there's tons of stuff that we can be sending back to the East Coast. Let's make some money. And as is true of all robber barons, it just kind of became a thing. So,
Awesome.
Yeah. And just there's so many fun little books that tell the story. And I have this like encyclopedia of trains in the Pacific Northwest, which is insane. And, you know, so there's the actual fun things to read. And then there's also the things that are a lot more like an encyclopedia. And you just kind of make your way through both. And I just happen to like all of that. Excellent.
Sounds like a recipe for a very interesting little railroading hotbed that, yeah, I have a couple ideas, and the research and history can be both daunting and exciting at the exact same time. So I completely appreciate that. Excellent. So let's dive into this. Let's start talking about this. So what are we talking about? We're talking about 1822 PNW, which, if you haven't figured out yet, stands for Pacific Northwest. It's going to be published 1822. 2022, and probably 23 by the time it actually is in your hands, playable, ready to go. Plays 3 to 5 players. Ken, what's your favorite player count for this?
I love it at 4. It's a lot of fun. And we probably should note that it is 2 to 5 with a scenario. But yes, that has been a little bit of a side project. A lot of people play 22 2-player with variant rules, and I wanted to make sure there was a 2-player scenario in 1822 PNW. So one exists, and it's actually a lot of fun.
Excellent. I love that. Now, I've only got to play this twice. I imagine you've played it a fair more amount than that.
A couple more times, yeah.
Excellent. Also, it should be noted, you know, I've played prototype versions, and, you know, there's still some things that are still kind of getting, you know, dialed in as we approach. There's always a little fine tuning that you kind of find happens. So I might be out of date on some things, but let's hope not.
All right, fingers crossed. I'll keep you straight.
Well, I mean, I just played it at track, so hopefully the world hasn't shifted since then.
Yeah, well, it depends too. What's funny about tracks is I was still adapting rules on the fly, so it depends on who taught you and whether or not I had figured something out or not. There was a problem that came up in an early game, like day 1, and what was great about tracks, I mentioned this in the Train Shuffling podcast, but it was played like 10 times over the weekend. And so there was a problem that came up in like the first play, and I was like, oh, interesting. That's unique. And I literally like was playing another game, but designing 22 PNW in the back of my mind. And the next table to set it up, I walked over there and I was like, this is a new rule. And it went great. It was perfect. But well, it just depends on what version you played that weekend.
That's funny. No, I played with another Ken, and he taught us, and it was very enjoyable. So let's dive in. So those familiar with the show know we go through our phases. So let's hop into the yellow phase. So the yellow phase is when we're going to talk about the privates and the market. Now, I will say the market is our standard 22 market. I don't think there's anything crazy here. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time. I don't know that it's a huge shenanigan aside from turn order. We have thoughts.
There's one pretty unique thing about the 1D stock market in 22 PNW, which is that if you are under the $150 stock value, your company can triple jump.
Oh, that's
so. So if you, depending on how you par your company, which is a little bit more of an interesting decision in 22 PNW than straight 22, because we'll talk about this in a moment, but when you merge, you get to pick your price, your par price, and you can select a par price that maybe will allow for you to triple jump on your next turn. So sometimes you can kind of get in those shares at a little bit lower rate when you make that conversion moment to a merger, or when you merge to a major, and then you can triple jump up, and that's always a really fun little puzzle to solve. And then staying under that 150 space gives you a little bit more incentive to withhold or half pay when you need to. So there's a little bit of shenanigan with that,
Okay.
but other than that, it's pretty straightforward.
Okay. I love that. You know what? I don't recall that even coming up that, I don't think we were that smart to make that happen in our plays,
Sure, sure.
honestly. But it's one of those things, right? Like when you can trade in the 4 and get the diesel at a discount. It's like when you do it, it must feel amazing because you just
You're like, I'm so smart.
luck had nothing to do with that. I totally engineered
right.
and pulled that off.
Absolutely.
So pretty awesome stuff. The privates. So I would say this is one of the biggest sandboxes in a 22 game, especially from a designer standpoint. I have a couple that stood out to me. I started on the eastern side, so I kind of geared my privates towards things on the east. So the lumber was a fun one for me, and like the lumber lodge, the mill, I believe it was.
Paper mill, yeah.
And then my heart, because I am a skier at heart, I had to get the ski lodge because that's amazing.
Right.
So
the
what
ski
other
house.
the ski house, which kind of like, the railroads were one of the ways that people used to get skiing, right? Like that's kind of what preempted that, or
Well, the funny thing there is that's actually kind of a modern imposition on the game because, ironically, there's on the map, there's basically the Cascade Mountains run through the center of the map, which are these just giant, beautiful mountains in the Pacific Northwest. And as you might imagine, originally the railroads went through the passes of the Cascades where it made the most sense, where it was the least there was the least work to get through the mountains. And so what's really funny is now in modern day, every single one of those passes from up in Vancouver, BC, all the way down through southern Washington, each of those passes has a ski resort in it.
of course.
And so it was one of those things that I was like, oh, this has to be here, And that conversation actually morphed out of a conversation that I had with Chris Rao, who is the kind of the leader of the Seattle crew that is famous for being the hundreds and hundreds of plays of 1817. And he and I were talking about the interesting part of how industry changes in areas and how that could be modeled in a game. And he's got a really cool idea for that in a game that he's working on. Hopefully that will come to fruition one day. But I was like, oh, you're right. Like, it is interesting how we do something in an area and it creates space for something else, an industry 100 years later,
Right.
or 50 years later. And so as much as people don't really take railroads to ski, there's definitely a fact that the railroad through an area created a space for the skiing to occur. And
Gotcha.
so I was looking for a private idea, and I was thinking like adding a revenue bonus to rail might be nice. And so it was kind of like interposing a couple of different pieces. And while historically nobody took the train with their skis on the back, I know that still happens in Colorado. So,
Right. Yes.
so I kind of threw a couple things together. That's one of the places where we are writing a little bit of a variant history, but able to pull on a lot of the local flavor. And I love the idea of someone being like sitting and playing this game in, southern Spain and being like, oh, it's so cool that there's all of these ski lodges through the Cascades. And, you're like, they've never been here to the Pacific Northwest, but they know that we love to ski. And hey, that's a win for me.
There you go. So I love it though. It's definitely a little fun one. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about some of the lumber privates, but what are some of the other privates that you just kind of had fun designing for this one?
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting story, right? When I built PNW the first time, I literally just took the stack of miners
Mm-hmm.
and the stack of privates and the majors from 22 and 22MX and just like put them together. And what I really did was develop the map first. So the map has changed a little bit over time, but has remained pretty consistent throughout. And
Mhm.
then so when I actually asked Scott for some feedback on the game originally, it was like the map was what was unique, and then there was some rules that I had added, timber being one of them, and we'll talk more about that, I think. And then but I literally didn't change any of the privates, and I used the private stack from 1822MX.
Okay.
And so Scott was like, this is going to be really cool. I like some of the things that you've done, but you really need unique privates because right now these are all Mexico's privates. And I was like, well, I know that. I did that for prototype reasons, but I totally hear you. And so he invited me into this space of saying like, hey, as you think about Pacific Northwest, what are some of the things that are unique to the area? And it just allowed to have just a lot of freedom with creating these privates, which was a lot of fun. And so it's about half of our private set is repeats from other 22 games that I just love. So
Sure.
you've got, your permanent local, you've got your permanent two, you've got mail contract, builder cubes, because there's builder cubes in 22 PNW like in
Love
22
builder
MX.
cubes.
Yeah, me too. And so anyway, so there's those. But then I went to create privates that were very Pacific Northwest themed. And so I drew on some just known history. I've been in the area. I've been living in Seattle for 10 years. And I was actually born here before moving to Southern Idaho as a kid. And so I spent a lot of time in the Pacific Northwest. And there's just some things that about the area. So I started kind of putting those in there. And then also I took some kind of familial inspiration to my father-in-law, my wife's dad, owned a lumber yard out on the peninsula. And
nice.
so he jokingly called himself the Lumber Baron. And so there is a Lumber Baron private in the game because, as people know about the Pacific Northwest, timber or lumber has always been one of our greatest exports. And it's one of the main reasons. Obviously, there were some natural minerals and things around that were being mined too. But paper, by way of tree, has always been kind of one of the main exports of the area. So building and then also as paper. And so in the town, so my wife is from Port Townsend area. She grew up on a little island off of Port Townsend. And so my father-in-law owned a lumberyard there, and it's got a lot of timber that had been clear cut and sent away. And then in Port Townsend, right outside of Port Townsend, there's actually a paper mill. So I kind of combined these little things and added them as private. So I've got timber in the game, which is a huge part of the game. And then the Lumber Baron private makes the timber better. And then there is a paper mill private, which allows you to place effectively a revenue increase on a city that is right next to a timber hex. So there's a couple things in there that were just really fun to play with, and they kind of layer on top of one another. And then another one that I love from historical reasons is there's the Pacific Portage Company, and this is a private and is actually a company. And basically, before railroads, they were basically taking barges down the Columbia River with these things. And then once the railroad started, the Columbia River was so big and the bridges were still under construction between the north side and the south side of the Columbia that they had to get stuff across the river. And so the Portage Company worked to get things across. So I was like, oh, this is such a huge part of the history because before there was rail, there was this portage, and it was really important to just the expansion of the area. So it's like kind of as a throwback, I threw this private in there. And then what I did is I made it effectively work kind of like, it functions like a ferry would, but it is just a track piece that can be placed in water. So the tiles are a little bit different for that one. And so you can place these tiles across the water. And because it's a game, you can also place it across the Sound, which is the area of water between like where Seattle is in Washington and the peninsula. And this allows you to have some really unique routes and maybe bypass some of those really expensive bridge costs if that's what you want to do. And also because it's a portage company, right? The major that owns it can use that track for free. But anybody else who owns it has to pay a small fee. So anyway, that's just one of the privates that I find to be really fun to play from a operational 18xx perspective, and then also historically, I just love all the flavor that comes with it.
It's it's amazing, and it's going to be a lot of fun. And I always love like exploring the new, minors and privates, just to find out like what they all entail and how you can use them, because I think that's a big chunk of 22 is not only when they come out, but how you can leverage them as quickly as possible. I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And I think that's another reason that the 22 system lends itself so well to the design I wanted to make, because, um, you know, in so many other 18xx games, the privates are just a way to move money around,
Right.
and or kind of put you in a different position at the beginning of the game. And what I love about 22 privates is that they all help you be better operationally. And that is one of my favorite things. Like 20, it feels like privates matter in
Right.
1822 games, and I love that. So
Absolutely. So talk to me about all the different ways that you handled concessions in this game.
yeah, or lack thereof, yeah. So I so one of the earliest goals of the game was to reduce time, right? I love
Hmm.
22, but a full game of 22 can take 7 or 8 hours, and
True.
nothing beats that narrative arc, right? You can't. There's not another game that gives you the breadth of the narrative than 22, and so it's worth those hours, in my
Right.
opinion. I play that happily, but I also love that experience, and I would love to have that experience in less time.
Yeah.
And so at the beginning I was like, okay, so where can we shave off time? What makes this long? And often one of the longer parts of 22 is the auctions, which we play 22 because of the auctions, so it can't go away. It's so important. But there's three different kinds of things in base 22 that you can auction. You can auction privates, you can auction miners, and you can auction concessions, right? And so I thought to myself, well, what if we just got rid of one of those? And so that was kind of hanging on one side. And then the other side was I really wanted to tell this story of the Pacific Northwest being a having railroads start here and not
Hmm.
having been dependent on majors, right? And so if you think about the narrative of how majors work with concessions, they basically start somewhere and then they gobble up miners, and that's great. But in the PNW, these miners became small majors before they became actual
Right.
parts of the majors that were coming out from the east. And so to kind of tell that story a little bit more historically accurately, that's great. It's early morning. Um, to tell that more accurately, I wanted to tell a story of how those miners came together, which then made the majors want to pay attention to the Pacific Northwest.
Right.
And so we, instead of having concessions, one of the huge differences in 22 PNW is that majors form by miners merging instead of having a concession that you take off the auction line.
Now you do have a talking about mergers. You do have something interesting that happens in order to make those mergers actually, I want to say, more historically accurate, right? Like, you talked a lot
Yeah,
about the east west progression. So
right.
the mergers is kind of how you did that. Do you want to walk us through
Yeah,
the best way to do that?
absolutely. So for me, I knew that I had to have only a set number of miners that had to be part of a merger conversion, so that way we could hold on to the home city um, puzzle of 22.
Right.
And that worked so the way I went about that is I said, okay, so as the majors were coming from the east, where did they cross into the territory? And so basically, whether you're talking about the Great Northern, which really came through like kind of the northern part of the United States and then kind of entered Washington through Spokane, or whether you're talking about the Northern Pacific, which really kind of came out from Utah and kind of angled up towards the Seattle area. So that one kind of comes in from the the southeast part of the map. And so I knew that when I had these different things set up, I wanted to make sure that the miners in those areas became the home stations for those majors. So the miners in 1822 PNW are in two different classes. There's the associated miners and the unassociated miners. There's 7 associated miners, and they are associated because they are associated with a major company. Then the rest of them are all merger potential targets. And so what's cool about that is sometimes just reading the variant setup of the miners and their ordering, you end up merging two very odd combination, because that's going to be what's best, right? And so that's one of the reasons why all of the miners are so good in 22 PNW, at least at different times. Subjectively at different times they're very good, even if sometimes they're skipped. So like, if you're watching this video, there's definitely miners on the board that didn't get played this time in the game picture that Chris is showing, and that's simply because of probably the order in which they came out. The 3 that are not built, 12, 15, 16, there's nothing wrong with those miners. They're great miners, but they probably just didn't come out early in the setup of this game. And because of that, they weren't right there to be merge targets. So that's kind of one of the interesting things about the merger in 22 PNW is we needed to make sure that the home stations stayed where they needed to be. And then so we made those associated, and then we allow any other unassociated miner though to then become the merge target for one of those associated miners to build a major.
Right. And what I think you got as a result is something that doesn't feel as tightly scripted as a typical 22 game, where you feel like, oh, this miner needs to merge with this major, or, only the 8 can work with the MR, or, like it feels like if you have the right track and the right setup, you can pretty much pull off some crazy things, and you're not limited by that either.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that was another goal of the design. So one of the huge goals for me was to make sure that we had a map that never built the same way. And so there's a few ways that's accomplished, but one of the main ways is, as is true of 22 games, the miners that come out in the first 1, 2, or 3 stock rounds dictate what is good in that game. What's unique about 22 PNW is that because you have to merge an associated miner with an unassociated miner, you kind of look at what your options are going to be, and then you're kind of making lemonade out of lemons. I mean, sometimes it's like, oh, those couldn't be more perfect to merge together.
Right.
And unfortunately, that's just going to cost you a lot of money, at least if the table knows what they're doing.
Right.
So sometimes the best option is to take the option that's going to cost the least amount of money, but maybe some of the most ingenuity in trying to connect. And, and some of one of the things I love about 22 is just the positioning of when your major should start, whether or not you want your major to look very powerful, because there's always the chance that you might be able to get over 60% of the certs. And so, maybe that obvious merger is great, and maybe you'll get to merge early, but then you have the first major and it might be the most powerful, but are you going to have the most shares in it? There's so many balancing questions in there that is just so much fun about the operational puzzle. And so, to that end, what I love is that often when you take a picture of the end state of 22 PNW, it always seems to look different. Sometimes everything's in the south, sometimes everything's in the north, sometimes everything on the east is built up, sometimes everything on the west is built up. And so unlike, in my opinion, 22 base, where you kind of have this north-south highway that goes down the middle of the board, basically always, 22 PNW tends to have a little bit more flavor as to the way that the track will develop, and is influenced even by the way that you can play the privates.
Right. Absolutely. We touched on the auctions already. So basically you have one streamlined auction, which I think kind of does 2 things. I think number one, I think it speeds up the game from a standpoint of your decision points are a lot clearer. Like, I don't think you have to worry about, oh, do I need to make sure I get that and get that? And then, oh, I no one bid on that, so I'm going to pick that up for cheap, right? Like there's
Right.
some of that in there, but it feels a little tighter because what you're bidding for is there's less options available, but
Yeah,
it's
there's just less
also,
options.
yeah, but I think what also happens is I don't know about you, but there's a tendency in core 22 games where money tends to be flush at the beginning and then dries up by the third round. And then nobody buys
Yes.
anything because they have no money left. And I kind of feel this stretches that out a little bit so that people
Mm.
have a little more funding longer so they stay in that fight pretty much the whole time the auctions are going on. I feel like you can always be in an auction. You're not going to, spend all your money on the second round and then have nothing left, right?
Yeah, it definitely has a little bit different pacing than the average 22. Partly because of the auctions. So because you only have 7 options each stock round to auction instead of 10, right? There's a little bit less stuff to spend money on. In really competitive games of 22 PNW, you spend quite a bit more, especially
Hmm.
on minors, because people can see. I encourage people to have set out all of the minors so they know the order that they're coming out in. And then because people can read that board state, there's, usually, especially things in the first stock round, they just go for quite a bit more, in my opinion, than they go for
Right.
in base 22. But another thing that's interesting is because, you don't. So in 22, you can flip a concession as soon as there's a 2 train on the board, right? And you can start a major. Well, you can't start a major in 22 PNW until you manage to merge, which means you manage to build the track between the 2 minors that you're going to merge.
Right.
And in this game, you have to own both the minors to merge them. You can't merge them with somebody else's minor. And so building the track between your 2 minors is important. And so sometimes, depending on how the minors come out, there can be a little bit more of a minor game because the majors don't come out as quickly because they have to be able to merge before they can come out. And due to that, those 2 trains last a little longer.
Yeah.
Or the 2s and 3s last a little longer because those last couple of 2s sometimes aren't picked up by majors until, right when. However, once those 3 trains hit in PNW, there is never a cash problem, and we blow all the way through to the east. I mean, it's one of those things where the train buy just looks like a linear upwards graph. Just goes straight to the moon as soon as that 4 train is purchased because
Nice.
everybody's just rocketing through those trains in the middle there. So yeah, so in a way, the auction does kind of make you shift where your money is going, and then the arc is a little bit different than in 22, and I think it's steeper at the end than in 22, but it's a little bit slower through the 2s. So it just kind of plays a little bit differently, and all that's intended to tell the story, right? That I wanted you to see that the little companies played a longer role at the beginning of the game before the majors come in, and everything just kind of goes to the moon.
Awesome. And, the other thing is, you mentioned that, have everything laid out so that everybody can see all of the upcoming minors and privates and everything that's out for option. I would also argue that the minors in this game are also, and the privates specifically, are very much usable by most, right? Where
Mm,
they, like, I
hmm.
don't feel like there's like some that are just super, super specialized because of the map design and, the various different places you're going to start and you're going to want to go. I kind of feel like every one of those smaller companies is in play for a majority of the people at the table. So yeah,
Right,
that lumber private, the paper mill might be great for you, but I can use it too. It's not like
right,
it's not going to be awesome like it is for you, but my hate draft of that is still going to pay me money, and that's
right,
okay, right?
right. Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. So we have the map up. So why don't we just move on to the green phase where we talk about trains and map. So the trains in the map, I think the trains talk to me a little bit about the train roster. Did you really mess with it that much? What'd you do there?
I didn't. Yeah, so this was actually a huge conversation for a long time because when I started, I thought, don't reinvent the wheel. I'm just going to use the same train roster as 1822MX. We have a very similar number of companies. So it's got to be right. Scott knows what he's doing. And so, and for the most part, we've kept it. But we had a lot of conversations because of the way that the early game is a little bit different than 22. There's people on their first play tend to not get through those two trains as fast as you will on your third, fourth play because you get more efficient at merging those companies. But also the story, the narrative there is a little bit different. And so people are like, these two trains seem to be lasting forever. And and I heard that. And, the question's always, is this a feature or a bug? And my argument is it's a feature. It tells one of the parts of the game that I really enjoy. So what's one of my favorite parts of 22 system is that there is this slow build of the miners because they play a very important role in the history of the railroading. And so I wanted to emphasize that. And so but I'll be honest, I copied the train roster from 22MX. So it was an accidental side effect that was really infused by the merger mechanic, right? So you couldn't tell when I designed the game, I couldn't have known that the way that I built the merger mechanic was going to lead to the majors coming out a little bit later, which would prolong the two trains a little bit. And so it turns out that that's the story I wanted to tell, but it was lucky happenstance that it actually helped that happen.
Right.
So then though the question became, well, what if that's not your favorite part of the game? And we'll talk about that in a little bit because we definitely tightened the train roster for the scenarios.
Okay.
But even if you're playing the full game of 1822 PNW, you're still 2+ hours under the full game of 22, right? Yeah. So it's just a significantly shorter game. And what a lot of people don't realize too is we rocket through the end set of trains way faster than in 22. And so because of that, you do spend a little bit more time in the twos, but you spend quite a bit less time in the end of the trains. And so it just kind of has this, rocket propulsion at the end of the game because as you mentioned, companies tend to be a little bit more flush with cash. So they have a little bit more money for those trains, which is kind of fun. So you get to play, as the designer, I get to play the fun part for me, which is watching these miners grow. And then I get to play the other fun part, which is running the E-trains, right? And so I want to build the map, and then I want to run for a ton of money, with the E-trains. And that's what you get to do with the way this is built. And like I said, lucky happenstance that just copying the 22MX train roster allowed for that. And it's amazing to me as a designer and somebody who's played this game a lot and who adores 22MX. 22MX, I agree with you as I listened to your last train shuffling, or not train shuffling, sorry. I know, Ouch. Wheel tapping. The last wheel tapping where you talked about 22MX, I was like, absolutely, like this was a great game. Like Scott did such a good job iterating on the 22 system in that game. And so that was my favorite 22 game before PNW, right? And so I would love to see that, and just lucky happenstance to bring that over and have it. It's just amazing to me how it changed the narrative. I mean, it's the same train set, but it's a different map. It's a different way of growing the companies, and all of a sudden you have a different game.
Yeah, one of the things I kind of found interesting is you started 22, and I think one of the first things your brain is doing is, all right, how fast can I convert my L train? And you do want to do that fast because you're going to miss a lot of revenue because there's not a lot of huge revenue centers that you can run an L for any kind of money. But you can get to that 2 train, but I don't feel it's this oppression that you can get in some of the other ones where if, I feel like you have a little more time to make that happen. So there's pressure there, but it's not, they're going to go away. It's more everybody else is just going to get a huge lead on you if you don't. Like, I think the pressure switched big time. And I like that.
Yeah, a little bit for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a little bit more of a release valve there. And just for listeners at home's sake, when we're talking about the two phase lasting longer, we're basically talking about one more set of operating
Right.
rounds. So we're not talking about like another hour here. We're talking about like it's marginally longer than other 22 games. But what you're starting to hint at, which is also a really unique byproduct of the merger system and these trains, is you get to run way more minors in 22 PNW because you have quite a bit less train liability. The reason being that when you form a major from two minors, you combine your train liability, you split it
Right.
in half. And so, unlike in 22, where you have to run a major for a whole operating round and you have to have run the minor for a full operating round, which is usually pretty easy to have done, it's not until the next operating round that you can acquire that minor and then therefore get rid of your train liability for that minor. But in 22 PNW, you merge two minors together, and all of a sudden you basically get rid of your liability, because for two minors for the price of one. And so what that means is you are able to run more minors, and therefore all minors become more important because everybody can run more. And if you play 22 consistently, you know that the person who tends to run the most minors and not have to take loans because they screwed up on their train liability, they tend to be in one of the strongest positions for
Right.
end game, right? And so the same is true here. You just get to like +1 the amount of minors that you're running.
Yeah.
Also, there's a supply demand problem, or not problem, feature in 22 PNW, which is that it takes two minors to start a major. So you need at least one more minor that you're going to acquire for extra shares. And you may even want two,
Right.
right? And so, because you're asking, like, how do I get those tokens in? How do I get those extra shares in? And so all of the miners go for more money because there's more of a demand for every miner. And also, it was really important to me that there wasn't miners that were just objectively bad.
Yeah.
In 22, there are objectively bad miners, and I don't love that. It's a design decision, and I can respect it. I know what it did, and I have adjusted for that in 22 PNW. But I just wanted you to say, like, any miner on the line, subjectively, at some point in any one game, could be great. They're not all awesome. They're not like all the miner that starts in Portland and has the upgrade token, right? But they're all situationally something that you would want to invest in. And you're going to get to the end of the game, and you're going to get to the end of the miner list, and you're going to be like, oh man, I could really use another one. And you're going to wish that you wouldn't have let that one export off the line back in stock round 2.
Absolutely. The it's a lot of fun. You left the Pullmans in, which I'm always a fan of
I did.
Pullmans. I one of my favorites is, getting that Pullman train out. And then we have lumber. So
Right.
I think the two things to talk about on the map when we discuss it are lumber and terrain, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So this is one of the few, like when we think of 18x, especially in the 22 choices, they tend to be long, thin maps, whether that's, horizontal in Canada or vertical in standard 22 or slightly cockeyed in Mex. They tend to have long areas that are not used, or they just
Right.
you just need to build track and cover terrain. Your map, however, tends to be very compact, and you can
Right.
reach revenue centers within a turn or two. But, the geography in your map also has, you now have, is it I want to say the Puget Sound is right there.
Yeah, the Puget Sound. Yep.
And then we also have the Cascades right to the right of it, that are not too far away. So you have these two huge divisors in your land space.
Right.
And it definitely makes it interesting that you can't build on those. There's always a way around things, sure, but
Right. Yep.
it definitely makes it interesting builds. And then, if that's not enough, you dot terrain around this map. And one of those terrain is, if you can see on the map, if I'm showing you, it's little green trees with money on it. Now, the nice thing is, you actually get money for that. So I think one of the best things about this game is the lumber. But Real quick before I let you loose on the lumber topic, the other thing that does, you mentioned it earlier, that comes back from mechs to kind of help with all these costs of, the terrain and everything, is we have the builder cubes, which I think
Right.
is a wonderful way for you to utilize a lot of miners to get a lot accomplished. And, I enjoy that. It doesn't strip money out of the company, so you can get to that 2 train a little faster without having to worry about that expensive mountain hex that you're sitting right in front of. So it gives you options.
Right.
If you want to know more about builder cubes, we can talk about it, but they're awesome. Right. They take off, you spend a turn, place a builder cube, takes off a certain amount of liability off of a tile. I want to say $40.
It's $40, yeah.
Off of a build hex. So if you have an $80 mountain or more, there are some more expensive ones here. Then you place builder cubes, and they can be by multiple companies, and it doesn't have to be your own. So you can work together with somebody who is across the table from you to build a mountain pass or things like that, which is pretty awesome.
Yes.
But let's talk lumber, because this is a clear decision and point of distinction in this game. And I think this, and then our last topic when it comes to the map. But I want to let you loose on the lumber, because obviously you've talked about its historical importance.
Right.
What is its gameplay importance?
I mean, the gameplay importance is that it kind of puts you into a really interesting decision space. When you lay a lumber tile, you choose a plain yellow track tile to place. You pay $10 for the cost of building through the hex. And then for the rest of the game, if you run through that hex with a normal train, a N train, a numbered train, not the E train, express trains don't stop for lumber, you then add $10 to the revenue of that train. So as long as you're running between two revenue points, a city and a town, or two cities, and you run through lumber, you get to add that $10 to your route. However, it also locks the orientation of that yellow tile for the rest of the game. And so you can't upgrade that tile. And so from the very beginning, miners are starting to lay these timber tiles that allow them to run for a little bit more, and they end up creating track lines that can't be changed for the rest of the game. And so you're running for $10 more than yellow phase can be really helpful by running through that. But then maybe in brown phase, you really wish that tile wasn't going that direction. So that's some of the fun operational puzzle that comes with timber. Also, one of the, I talk about design goals. I had a list of design goals when I started, and one of them was, I love E-trains. I think they're one of the best inventions in 18xx games. I love the run your tokens, double them. However, you might notice this by now, but I'm kind of like a feel good game guy. I'm not a feel bad game guy. And there are definitely two different approaches to games.
Sure.
And I just tend to be like, oh, hey, I do this for fun. I do this to hang out with people. And so when there's feel bad moments in games, I appreciate that there's places where, you want differentiation between players, right? I don't want everybody to have the same experience. However, I don't love feel bad moments in games. And so one of the feel bad moments in 22 is when you're forced to buy a gray train and you have to buy a 7 train instead of an E train. And, some people in the hobby may say, well, you should plan better. But I tend to think like, well, yeah, but, what if the 7 train wasn't just this curse, but rather something that you could actually, what if it was another tool in your toolbox? And so sure, if you're forced to buy the 7 train and you didn't plan for it, it's going to not be great. And I didn't really undo that. But what I did do is I wanted to make sure that if you feel like an operational master, you can run a 7 train for as much as an E train. And that's accomplishable. That's one of the really cool things about 22 PNW is that because the timber can't be picked up by an E train, and because the Pullmans can be attached to a 7 train, the way the map is designed is if you can solve the puzzle, you can definitely run a 7 Pullman train, especially if you got something like the Lumber Baron Private, for easily as much as a E train running like 5 tokens.
Nice.
And so that was just kind of a fun little, like, I don't know if I'd call it an Easter egg, but it's just a part of the game that, if you've played a lot and you're looking for an operational puzzle to try and solve, running that 7 P train with a Lumber Baron Private is just money, like both literally and figuratively. Just a lot of fun.
It's you're right when you say puzzle. Like I'm just trying to densely pack as much wood into one area. Now, granted, other people are going to be able to access that at some point. You know, you can only token somebody out for so long, but it's a lot of fun to be able to run that train and pick up all those extra dits along the way. It's
Yeah, I think like there's a route on the map where you can get up to 8 timber tiles in between 2 revenue centers.
yeah,
If you run the track right, and if you use a private, which I'm not going to tell you because there's a little bit of play and find out, play and solve in it.
sure.
But you know, when you add $80 to your 7 train between 2 revenue centers, somebody running an E train is just like, you did what? So
Yep.
that's always a lot of fun.
And it's a great place to dump a permanent 2 train.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and then I guess the last thing we can talk about is just the train. And you know, well, I can't take much credit for this. I mean, the Pacific Northwest is the way it is. It's beautiful, and it's hilly and mountainy, and it's one of the things that makes it so amazing. But we got a lot of water, and we've got a lot of mountains, and trains don't like water, and they don't like mountains. And so, you know, playing with those mechanics and in building the map, I mean, it's just the map of the Pacific Northwest. You know, I
Right.
didn't do some brilliant thing to build this map a certain way. And so, you know, I'm again, you know, at the kind of at the whim of the creator here. And so it's just kind of fun to see. But, you know, but one of the things that really does is one of the things when you overlay the natural geography of the area with the intent of copying the progression of major railways through the area, you get this really interesting conflicting goals, which also happens to work really well for a game, which is that all of the destination and homes run east-west in the game,
Right.
and basically all of that is impeded by the mountains through the middle,
Right.
right? And so if you're going to make your home and destination happen, you're going to be going through the mountains. And so figuring out when and how you're going to do that is just one more operational puzzle for 22 PNW. And then also the water plays a huge part. You know, we've got the sound that separates the peninsula of Washington from, you know, the main body. And so being able to play with that Portage company up there that I mentioned earlier is a lot of
Mm-hmm.
fun. And then the Columbia River runs between Oregon and Washington, and such a natural barrier. And so what's cool there is there are 3 big bridges that span the Columbia River. So if you're going to be spanning the Columbia River, you are going to be the one building those bridges. And so those cost almost as much as a mountain does. In fact, sometimes more than a mountain does in this game. And so, you know, strategically using builder cubes to lower those costs, choosing, you know, where it may just be a better use of your money to use the Portage company for $10 instead of spending 3 turns to have builder cubes to get a bridge across the Columbia. I mean, these are all little decisions that are just part of the natural geography that I just can't even really take that much credit for.
Yeah, it definitely works out. I mean, you still have to interpret that and make it into a game system that works. So, well done.
Yeah.
It's definitely one of my favorite maps to play on. I really enjoyed it. So, there's really only one thing left to talk about on the map. I mean, well, obviously we could probably sit here and talk all day, but
Yeah.
to move conversation along, let's talk to me a little bit about the Portland and Seattle. You did talk about it at the top of the show. So how does that play out in the map itself?
Yeah. So there's kind of some local lore here. Seattle and Portland are like 2 rivalry cities that are steeped in brotherly love. So we absolutely just wail on one another, and you know, talk about how you know, Seattle's so much better than Portland, or Portland's so much better than Seattle. But we will go to the ends of the earth to defend one another to anybody on the outside of the Pacific Northwest. So don't talk bad about Portland to me. You're not from here. You don't get to do that.
Rose City forever.
And so, exactly. And so there's a little bit of this, there's always this, Rose City, Emerald City feud. And And so it's like built out of love, but also just a thing that everybody in these cities knows. I mean, all of our sports teams are rivals, rest in peace Sonics, but the Trailblazers against the Sonics. We've got the Portland Timbers against the Seattle Sounders. Just any way you cut it, we're always kind of at war with one another. But the corridor, the I-5 corridor, between Portland, Seattle, and then Vancouver, BC, that whole area is known as Cascadia by those who live in the area. And so it's kind of known as the Cascadia rivalry. And so I couldn't help, but I had to make this really hard decision when I was like, okay, so which one gets to be London? And which one gets to be the token revenue center for the Pacific Northwest? And the answer was, early on, it was obviously Portland. I mean, when the history starts for this, like the era that this game is set in, it's clearly Portland. Portland is clearly the stronger city. And today, Seattle is like far and above not only because I live here and I'm a little bit biased, but also just if you look at, the wealth and the companies that are here. And while it's not completely train related, Seattle is just become one of the biggest ports, so much bigger of a port than Portland is. And so just kind of across the board, Seattle is definitely kind of that gray 100 value city. I mean, right. if we're completely honest, but I wanted there to be this option for that to be Portland, right? And when you start gaming, what you start historically, but to make a fun game, you have to have variance that allows for an alternate reality that could have happened, where Portland is the dominant city in the.
Sorry, could you say that again?
I didn't say Siri. I said city. My watch just started talking to me. So when you're thinking about that, you have to, you want to consider both those things. So instead of making one or the other, I said, well, why not both? And so in PNW, we have this dueling cities rule. So even though both of the cities can use the upgrade tokens, the upgrade revenue tokens, only one can upgrade at a time. And so they both start at that white 20 value. But then only one will get to the 40 value, the yellow 40. And then only one will get to green because there's only one set of upgrade tokens that have to be split between the two. Now, you may, if you are in the phase right before and the next phase opens, you may skip ahead. So if Seattle is at 40 yellow and Portland's at 60 green and brown phase opens, Seattle can pay double the cost to jump Portland. Right. And so that's where there's a little bit of this dueling, and then company order matters. And are there still miners at play on the board? You can't skip from yellow to gray if Portland hasn't been started the whole game. And at the end of the game, it just kicks out and they're like, oh, I'm going to pay $100 to upgrade all the way to gray phase. You can't do that. You have to upgrade until you can't. And if you're being blocked by the other city, then you can skip the other city. So it's just this kind of fun variant rule. And two things that are different in PNW about that than others. First, obviously, there's two cities that can be a focal point for trains, right? The one that gets to the 100 obviously becomes the more powerful E-train location. Right. But the second thing is both Portland and Seattle are pass-through cities. So unlike London, unlike Mexico City, you can pass through them on your route, which makes it a much more to me, makes it a very interesting operational puzzle on how to include those cities on your route. And if, depending on how tokening goes, depending on the miners, depending on which tokens you pick up, you can often run Portland and Seattle in a route in the E-trains. And so that's always a good goal. And I like that a lot too, because as the Pacific Northwest developed, what was a lot of east-west movement of goods across the area. Now, so much of the movement of people is up and down the I-5 corridor. And so because Portland and Seattle are on that corridor, if you're running a train from Portland to Seattle, you're doing a better job at public transportation than we actually are in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think our gameplay does not mirror reality when it comes to actual efficiencies of train networks.
100%.
Awesome. So, I think this is a good time because I believe Portland and Seattle also, I think you mentioned a lot of stuff there that really makes them the shenanigan that they are, right? Like
Right.
leveraging them,
Yes.
the two cities fighting against each other. So we're gonna. I don't want to say slip right into the brown phase, but that's what I said. So here we are.
Here we are, rough phase.
We'll call it russet today. So
Yeah.
basically, the Portland Seattle thing is a lot of fun and it's a great lever to play with.
Right.
But, I also think that the lumber can really be a shenanigan because, you can build it, somebody else can steal it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting too, like I mentioned earlier. I mean, it's a shenanigan in the fact that, like, if you don't have any plans on running it, you can lay it and it can dead end somewhere. One of the unique things is there's two privates in this game that allow you to break placement rules, or that just break normal placement rules. So you'll notice if you've looked at the map online or in the video, both the mountain hexes and the water hexes actually have spurs in them. The reason for that is the Pacific Portage company that we've talked about allows you to lay a tile across water, and there is another tile. You can actually see it on the board. It's in the middle of the mountains there, but it can be placed. It's a tunnel, a tunneling private, and you can place that, and you can go through the impassable mountain hexes through the Cascades. And so, because of those two privates, any tile can be laid in such an orientation that it dead ends into a technically impassable spot unless the private isn't played. And so yeah, there's definitely I'm going to use this timber to be as helpful to myself as possible and make some extra dollars. Or you can lay lay that timber hex differently and be like, well, unless you get this private, you're not going to be able to use this timber hex like I am. So there's definitely some shenanigans there for sure. And also just competing with the 7 train that I, talked about earlier is just a ton of fun. And then, the Portland Seattle thing is always a lot of fun. In a great game, in like the perfect game, you get the miner in Seattle and the miner in Portland in the starting lineup. And then it's just a war the entire game. Often one of those, because of the variant way that the miners come out, often one of those cities drives the economy of the game.
Right.
And then it's not until late game that it comes in, because you can pass through both those cities. It's not uncommon for the map to generally move towards the other city, just in way of knowing that if you can get a token in the other city as well, those E-trains are just going to be running for huge amounts of dollars. So yeah, so there's definitely some shenanigans there. Lots of stuff to play with. And yeah, there's one private that I haven't talked about here. I didn't talk about on train shuffling, but it's got shenanigan written all over it. And it's called the Backroom Negotiations Private. And what's very cool about this private is it actually allows an unassociated miner to become an associated miner. And this has huge gameplay ramifications as long as it comes out early, right? As in all variant setup games, the backroom negotiations really needs to come out in like the first 1 or 2 stock rounds for it to be the most powerful.
Right.
But when it comes out, it is a lot of fun because, there are multiple places on the map where you can make the miner next to the destination city your home city for the major. And so that gets crazy because then you can run a 2 train from your
destinate. Yep.
your new home station to the destination station right away. And so that can be a lot of fun. And so that's probably like the main shenanigan private, I think, in the whole set. It's a lot of fun to play with. And also it helps a little bit with pulling some of those associated miners that may be deep in the stack towards into play earlier. So figuring out how to play those things together is always a lot of fun.
Absolutely. It's a lot of fun. Ours came out early, so it was, it's everything you said it was. I totally get that. The other thing we're going to talk about in shenanigans, because they're kind of the big levers. But the other thing you kind of added to this one that I think it's one of the first times we've seen a 22 that ships with a decent amount of scenarios, and you've actually developed a few for this game specifically. So
Yeah.
what's coming with the base game?
Yeah, so for me, I know, like I mentioned earlier, that not everybody likes the long, drawn out phase. Phase two, that is kind of a hallmark of 22, in my opinion. And so the MRS, the medium regional scenario setup for 22 is very popular. And if you've played it, you know that it feels like a very different game.
Sure.
You're just like racing through the beginning of the game. And those games tend to have like a lot of yellow and green track and then gray, like city revenue locations, because there wasn't as much time in the game to upgrade all of that track, because it just plays a lot shorter. And just like how the medium regional scenario knocks off a couple of hours off of the play of base 22, the same is true for the short scenario in 22 PNW. So maybe not quite as much. I tend to think that the short scenario knocks about an hour to an hour and a half off of your group's playtime. You know, mileage always varies on these things.
Sure.
You know, my group plays the base game of 22 PNW in 4.5 to 5 hours. Obviously, we've played it a lot. And we have some table rules that I'd encourage. Like, we set up all the variable miners at the beginning so we can see what's coming. We also run all of our miners in phase one and phase two. We run them concurrently. So everybody is just laying track and paying themselves out. And that helps all of that kind of move along a little bit quickly. But yeah, so we play in about 4.5 to 5 hours for base. And then we play the short scenario in about 3.5 to 4 hours, right? Oh. So it definitely cuts off about an hour. And I don't know, we don't tend to play much faster than that as a group because we like being with one another. So I think that if you just sit down and your group is there to just, you know, knock out a weeknight game of 22 PNW, absolutely could happen. Sure. So, you know, especially once you play the game a few times and you know what you're looking for and you know what you want to build, it definitely can happen. So that's the short game scenario. That one's built specifically for 3 to 5 players. And the main thing that's happening there's two things that change. One of them is that the train roster shrinks. So there's quite a few less L trains. It feels very much like the 22 MRS, where the 2 trains are cheaper, and then the conversion is cheaper, and then it's even cheaper. The first person to convert pays more than the rest of the people who convert their L to a 2, and that's because that first part of the game is so quick that you're going to need all the help you can get to get through it. And when I played the short variant last time, we felt that train rush all the way from the beginning. So it's a very different game. I love it. It's still fun. It's not, in my opinion, as fun as the full game experience, but you're going to enjoy it. Another thing that we decided to do with that short variant is that you randomly assign a combination of 2 miners, an associated and unassociated. There's a little table in the rule book. You assign 1 to bid box 1. So kind of like the concession for the FNM in 22MX, and then the miner that's right next to it. Similarly, it starts and it's worth $200 as a starting bid, but they're, you know, just a guaranteed good pairing, and that kind of like that throws the whole thing into overdrive, because as we talked about, some of that 2 phase is lengthened by the fact that you actually have to not only get a pair of miners, but you need to connect that pair of miners. Well, here, the set table for what could end up in that first spot is basically paired with, just in my opinion, as the designer, the best 2 miners for each major. Gotcha. And so you put those in the first box, they should go for a ton of money. But because that will probably be the first major to form, all that just happens faster. So the short scenario is a wild ride. It's like the Wild West of 22. So I encourage you to enjoy that and try it out. And that's just a lot of fun. And so then the second scenario.
So you also have a Southern Regional, correct? That's a smaller.
So, yeah, exactly. So there's a Southern Regional scenario. And so it actually doesn't change the board at all. Okay. It just takes the minors and majors off of the northern part. So in the northern area of the board, you've got the Canadian Pacific Railroad is one of the majors, and then the Great Northern is the other major that's up there. And then there's a couple of minors, obviously the associated minors, and then the other minors. And so you can see kind of in this picture, you've got in the upper northwest, you've got this that's where the CPR starts, and then kind of in the northeast below Calgary is where the Great Northern starts, and both of those are kind of out. So that is, you just circled Spokane, and so Spokane is basically kind of the northern border of the southern regional scenario,
Right.
And then all the minors and the majors there and down are the majors that are in play. Now, the top of the map has some good revenue centers in it, and it's not out of play. It's just not going to be being built by any miners. So if you want to go play up there, by all means, go for it. But what's specifically what I'm trying to get at here in the southern regional scenario is to shrink the play space a little bit, specifically making it great for 2 and 3 players. So you take out 2 of the majors, so there's only 5 majors in play. There's 4 less minor companies, and then most of the gameplay takes place on the southern part of the map, but you still get to interact with all of the privates still matter. And so it's just kind of a condensed version of the game that just helps the game feel smaller and more tight and shorter for those who like playing at 2 players and 3 players. Yeah, so that's the southern regional scenario. And then the last thing that is really important to me, and I've actually written about this on Board Game Geek, but is the starting packet variant. So I am all about making 1822, but 18XX in general, as approachable as possible for as many people as want to try it out and play it. And so another one of the design goals, which I've been talking about throughout the podcast, was to make this the most approachable 22. Right. So if you want to start in the 22 family and you haven't played a 22 game before, I wanted 22 PNW to be the one that you picked up because it includes so many of the same rules from base, but it's a little simpler. You're not worrying about concessions. Mergers tend to be a little bit more common of a mechanic in operational 18XX games. And then also it has just a shorter playtime. And so all those things kind of combine to make 22 kind of natural, or 22 PNW naturally more approachable than some of the other games in the system or in the family. However, you still run into the same problem, which is that 22 is an auction game at its heart. And it's really hard to navigate an auction as a first-time player, whether it's your first time to 22 PNW or 22 at all. You look at the privates, you look at the minors, and you say to yourself, like, I have no idea what's going on here. And so I wrote a starting packet variant with the core idea being that it would help 22 new to 22 players or new to 22 PNW players be able to just jump right into the action of the game, skip the auctions at the beginning of the game, and effectively, depending on player order, you're dealt 2 minors that work well together, and then 2 privates that usually a veteran player of 22 PNW would try to get into their portfolio if they were playing the major that your position is associated with. And so, some of the rules changes here are just simply that at the beginning, after you pass out the player order cards, you pass out the starting packets, 2 minors, 2 privates, and nobody has any cash. And then you skip stock rounds until somebody upgrades an L train to a 2 train. So you just play operating round, and you're just acquiring money. And what we've noticed is that after you've kind of got in the zone on your 2 minors and you're working to combine them to form into a major, when you actually get to the next stock round, which triggers right after the operating round in which that first upgrade happens, you're ready to actually look at the auction and make meaning of it. Right. So all of a sudden you can say, oh, okay, I can see why I might want that minor because I might be able to acquire it and bring it into my major that I'm forming so I can get more shares. Or, oh, I can see why that private could be very good for me because maybe it lets me, blast through the mountains right here. Or maybe it lets me lay a couple extra tiles, which helps me get to my destination faster. Or maybe I'm right by the water, and so it'd be great to have that Portage company and stuff like that. So the starting packets, it's variable about how much time it's actually going to save you. Because if it's your first game, you're just looking at a long game anyway. However, it does save quite a bit of time in the fact that you don't have to evaluate the auction state for the first 3 rounds of the game. And then it also, I as the designer, I'm not going to put this in the rule book, but man, if you just play the game, to the 4s your first time or something, and you use the starting packet, you're just going to be far and away more ready to see more of what the game has for you. And I specifically paired minors with the privates so that you can see some of the cool synergies. If you play this game all the way to the end, which I'd recommend, it's a lot of fun, obviously. But you're going to see some unbalanced, really powerful combinations that will that you'll be trying to shoot for the games. Because if your table lets you get these really powerful combinations, you're going to be in a really good spot. And so not only do the starting packets give new to 22 or new to 22 PNW players kind of a leg up and ease them into the experience a little bit more, also will show them some strategy that they might start shooting for later in their plays. So that was for me just a really important add-on to make sure that people could play this. And I have to give a ton of credit to Josh Starr, who did this in 6167 when he published that. Honestly, I teach 6167 all the time now as a beginning 18xx game, or as the game that I play with my family. I've mentioned this before, but I have 2 siblings that are in high school, and then my dad and my brother-in-law but all play 18xx with me. And so this is one of our go-tos because after, they only play when I'm around, really. They don't play without me. And so it's a lot easier to be like, oh, let's just pass out these starting packets and start playing than it is to be like, okay, remind me why I care about this minor or this private again. So anyway, I took that right out of Josh Starr's playbook and thought, man, this is such a great idea. I'd love to see it in more games. And so obviously I had to put it in mine.
Yeah, I definitely think, 61, I think it was initially started to just kind of speed up setup, because initially, the first part of 61 can really feel long. But, even veteran players playing with the packets is just, it speeds it up. So yeah, maybe you use the packets even as an experienced player, but I never really realized it's a great way to show off power combos. So you either know to try and get them, and to try and keep them away from other people, right? Like it really kind of highlights that, which is great.
And what was fun about building the packets is they're all powerful, right? So I wouldn't say it's balanced, but nobody's like out of it, because everybody's running this really crazy power. And it's like, well, are you going to operate that better than the other players, or are you just going to invest in the one that you think is the most powerful in this game? And so it was a fun experiment. And my game group played a lot in that. I was like, okay, we're just going to sit down and I basically said, okay, everybody pick 2 minors, pick 2 privates, and then we kind of, switched them around and was like, oh, okay, it'd be cool to show off this thing. And it was a really fun design experience too. So
yeah, so definitely encourage it in anybody who's thinking about designing games, especially a 22 based or something that has mergers in it, just to kind of have packeted ideas ready to go. It's just it's a great way to experience a game, and it allows you to see through the designer's eye what they think is powerful. So good job. Right. Love it. Awesome. So that brings us up to the feels. So in the gray phase, we like to talk about the feels. I think it's a little awkward to ask the person who designed it how they feel about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to summate my feelings, which is pretty much, I love the timing and pacing. We kind of talked about it with the trains. I really found that the pressure for the 2 to L conversion and with building cubes, that combination changes that and how it feels. And I really enjoy that. And I love it when I can just maximize a route, and I can just make crazy routes and have a ton of fun with them. And lumber and Pullmans always allow me to do that. And the lumber, the way you execute it, the way those are not upgradable, great at the beginning, annoying later on, always happens. And I don't miss concessions. Not not at all. So for me, that's a win all the way. I think concessions. It's a me thing. I'm just not good at them. I never pick the right one, or I spend too much for the one I want instead of the one I should buy. It's just a point of aggravation for me, and I don't miss it at all. And I love the map build. Like you say, I walked by that board many times during the weekend of tracks, and you're absolutely right when you say no two map was the same. It's not like it's a game where you can look at a map, study it, and learn the best routes and then just go repeat it, because how things happen and your group think and your game think and what lands where, it changes how that game's played so much that it's not one of those, oh, I'm just going to always build this one loop. That might not be an option for you. And I really loved it. So totally. Well done there. So what I'm going to say for feels for you is, and I think you've covered a lot of these points, so I'm going to ask you to kind of ball it up together, is what are some of the feels you wanted to create in the player on the other side of a game? Like what are a couple of the key feels you wanted for them?
Yeah. Well, what was key for me is if you're going to have another 22 game, it should feel like a similar but different puzzle, right? I have 22 and 22 MX on my shelf. And so why do I need 22 PNW? Well, it's a great question. And so for me, I wanted it to feel like a new puzzle, right? And so if you already like it, you want more of it, right? And so I wanted to be more than just a different map, which, as we've talked about at length, just the natural geography led itself to feeling like a very different game. But for me, I wanted it to feel different. And I wanted it to be able to not only stand alone as a great game, but also to be able to hang in there with 22 and MX as something that you might have to have a hard decision. Oh man, do we want to play with the very cool national, puzzle that Scott introduced in MX, or do we want to play with the merger puzzle that's in 22 PNW, And so thinking about 22 is not only a family that's built on the same foundation, but different games in the family that give you different puzzles is kind of one of the things that was a huge piece for me, as trying to figure out, well, where does this fit in the family? And, why might I have both or more? And I happily have both, and I have reasons of playing all of the different 22 titles. So I wanted 22 PNW to feel like it was worth its shelf space, if you'd say. And another field for me that was really important is I'm sure it's come out. You probably can tell by now, but I love the Pacific Northwest. I mean, this is just an amazing place to live. It's an amazing place to be. It's an amazing place to visit. And so for those who live in a part of the world that makes it hard to get to the Pacific Northwest, I can bring a little bit of that to their table. Awesome. And I wanted that to feel, like the area. And I feel like the game does kind of encapsulate some of the great parts about the Pacific Northwest, the beautiful geography, just kind of the nature of, this kind of fake false rivalry between Portland and Seattle. You get to participate in that a little bit. Once you know the story, you can see it through the way that the map rewards certain routes in the end game, the ways in which the history of the area morphed from being something that was going very east-west to being something that now most travel in the Pacific Northwest is north-south. And so, all these little things kind of give you just pieces or feels of the area. And so for me, those were probably the two main feels that I was going for. I wanted you to feel like you were playing a game in the Pacific Northwest, which is undergamed in my experience. And then also or in my opinion, I suppose. And then also that you feel like it was a new puzzle to solve, something new to add, to not only the 22 system, but also just to your library of 18xx games, right? So, I'm a person who does a lot of culling of my collection of all games, when I feel like two games are kind of providing the same play experience for me. And so as a person who, knew that I was coming into the family a little late, I wanted to make sure that it felt like not only that it had its own space. And so I kind of say, like, if 22 is the granddaddy, like this is the kind of rogue, grandkid that's like, oh, that's right. Well, My name is 22, but I have a different idea how this should go, and that's kind of what I wanted 22 PNW to feel like.
Yeah, I think it's filtered down, right? And it's gone through a Scott filter with MX and then onto you.
Right.
I personally I like regular 22, but I enjoy MRS a little bit.
Right.
But also my pain point with MRS is exactly what you said. It's a little rushy up front, and that if you're just, it's one of those I feel like you can lose pretty early, right? And then you're just kind of playing.
Yeah.
And Canada just never clicked for me. It's just just not really a fan. But played Mexico, ended up picking that up, and I most certainly am picking up PNW. Speaking of, if you are interested in all we've been talking about, Scott has Wave 5 up on Kickstarter right now, so you can go check that out and get on board.
That's over on Wednesday. What is that date?
As in like 3 to 4 days from now from recording?
Yeah, exactly.
But, that isn't to say that he won't potentially put Wave 5 up again in some other form, but maybe not at the price that it's at now. So if you're listening to this when we drop it, which will be tonight, I highly encourage you to check that out. And, there are many great games. And a friend of the show, a personal friend of mine, Pierre, has 18NY up there, which is pretty cool. There's
super cool game.
This is an expensive wave for me. The other ones I've been able
It really is.
I've been able to get one or two in the last couple. This one's rough. This one's costing me.
Right. And it's like I just like I've played them all now, and every time I was like, well, maybe this one. No, every single one of them has been so good. And GB was one of my first games of 18XX, and it's just a fun game. And NY is wild because of the way those miners become part of the New York Central and all of the shenanigans that entails. And I've been playing SJ most recently, and it is brutal. The just because it's been a while since there's been a new game with the buy sell buy stock round.
Yeah. Those get brutal.
Yeah, I forget. And also, what's really unique about SJ is that when you par your company, you par your company at like $100, say. Well, you can sell stock in companies. You can buy and sell stock in companies that haven't run yet, which is not uncommon for 30 style games. But also, they don't set at par. So when you buy at 100, and then if somebody else is floating the company, well, you come in and buy a share at $100, and then you sell it. Boom. And that impacts the amount of the treasury that company is going to get, because they only get. So now the next share purchased is at the 82 or 90 or whatever the next. I think it's 90.
So it just kills really the wild funding. Yeah, just
the number of companies in my most recent game that left the stock round in which they were floated in the yellow zone is significant. And so it's just it's a wild one. I don't have a lot of thoughts about the map yet. I'm excited about it, but I really need to get in it a little bit more to feel like I can comment on that. But the stock rounds, man, if you like that, it's fun.
Excellent. So I hope to do New York as our next show, but we'll see. I'm going to try and get Pierre on for that one. So
that'd be awesome.
He's local, but I think we'll see if we can get him to call in. All right. So that brings us up to the priority deal marker. Now, the priority deal marker traditionally is a Tony segment. He likes to have his unique priority deals for every single game that he plays. Now, I realize that there's no priority deal marker in a pass order game, but what would you like to see on the table if we were to give you the wood to do one?
Yeah, if you put if you had like a priority marker that had number 1 on it, so like the 1 was special, like the first person, right? If you come out with the most cash, you get the whatever. I would have to say it would be an Orca.
Okay.
Like whether you're in Seattle or not as much in Northern Oregon, but all the way through the Puget Sound and up into Vancouver or in BC, like we're just the orca is just the
Interesting.
The animal spirit of the Pacific Northwest. And so killer whales, man, are beautiful and majestic, and we are lucky enough to get to see them pretty often in the area, as there are resident orcapods that live in the area and don't go very far. They migrate up and down the Pacific, or the Sound and the Pacific Northwest coast, as they are feeding but then there's also transient orcapods that come in through the area depending on the time of year. So it'd have to be an orca. So if you could get an orca and with a big one on it, that'd probably be your go-to priority deal. Otherwise, you're probably picking something very city related.
Okay.
And so that kind of gets tricky, right? Because
an
you're
emerald
like, well,
or a rose, or
yeah, an emerald or rose, that'd be cool. Or if you're in, you could use a Oz, Emerald City, Wizard of Oz, kind of priority deal, right? If you want to go that way, you could go, Space Needle is a Seattle landmark that everybody kind of knows. Just a big mountain would probably work too. There's a couple of little things that would be kind of fun things to pass.
Piece of lumber,
number one.
Just work.
Yeah, here you just carry around like a 2x4. Here you go. That's it. Make little 2x4 cutouts and put numbers on them, and everybody has to move these
different heights for 1, 2,
around.
3, 4. There you go.
That's right.
I can get behind that.
I like it.
Excellent. Well, Ken, thank you so much for filling in for Tony today. You did a great job. And I love everything you brought both to the game and to the show. So I appreciate you spending 96 minutes with us today. So
absolutely. Well, that's my fault. I love to talk, but it's good to be here, Chris. Love talking to you as always. And yeah, it'll be fun. I can't wait to get this game in a physical copy and play it with you.
Excellent. You and me both. Well, thank you everybody at home for listening, watching, and doing what you do. Be sure to check out the Kickstarter or look for Wave 5 on the All Aboard website if you're interested. And I kind of think you will be after all this chatter. Definitely something worth checking out, especially if you want to get into the 1822 system. I think you could do a heck of a lot worse. So excellent. Thank you as always. Have a great day. Thanks, Ken, again, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. This Week and Each Week is brought to you by Game Toppers. Upgrade your gaming experience at GameToppersLLC.com. Chris and Tony would love to thank all the patrons who contribute to make this show possible. Your support goes a long way to maintaining and upgrading the show on a weekly, monthly, yearly, or whatever basis. We'll see you next time.